What's up, you team of bad savages? My name is Tom, and today I'm gonna react to Americans Forgotten Entanglement. Yes, I did it. I pronounced it correctly. And also, guys, don't forget to like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications so you know the drill. And also, I'm not alone today, by the way. I have my friend from America with me. He's gonna react with us together. His name is Mr. George Washington. So, Mr. George, nice to see you here, and let's jump in.
Pacifism is objectively pro-fascist. This is elementary common sense. If you hamper the war effort of one side, you automatically help out that of the other. Nor is there any real way of remaining outside such a war as the present one. In practice, he that is not with me is against me. You might believe that quote came from George Bush, Dick Cheney, or Wolfowitz. It sounds exactly like the kind of rhetoric they used in the build-up to the Iraq War. But actually, it's a quote from George Orwell. And what's more, it's objectively true. The context in which George Orwell came to say this was during the outbreak of the Second World War. During its first year, a wave of pacifist sentiment swept Britain, with protests and town hall debates in which many figures argued for peace with the Nazis. Orwell took it on himself to go from town hall to debate the case for war with Hitler. And it was during those days and during those debates that he made that statement.
I just want to emphasize on this guy's accent. I love the way he speaks. This is the first thing. The second thing is, guys, for those who don't know George Orwell, it's a famous author. He wrote like bestseller called 1986. I think I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, it's about a book about dictatorship. So if you don't know, check it out. Very interesting book.
The anti-war movement itself also went silent once German bombs started falling on London, at least in Britain. Here are students in Berkeley protesting for peace with Hitler in 1940, probably not something they mention a lot on campus these days. The public debate around military conflict and responsibility in a conflict mostly goes into one singular direction, that being that if a military intervention fails or is built on faulty justifications, those who command it will be held to account. However, if a military intervention succeeds or is built on a very solid justification, those who opposed it are not put in a position of responsibility. For example, Jeremy Corbyn opposed Western military intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, including retroactively, and even goes out to eat pizza with people who deny the Bosnian genocide by Serbian forces. However, you will be hard-pressed to find people questioning him on this outside of the Bosnian media. Henry Kissinger is notorious for his decisions to needlessly prolong the Vietnam War and the undermining of Chilean democracy for his support of Pinochet's coup. You will, however, barely see Kissinger receive criticism or be held to account for his actions during the Bangladesh genocide of 1971, when the Pakistani army murdered hundreds of thousands of people, and Kissinger gave the crimes his seal of approval through diplomatic silence and congratulating his Pakistani allies on how well they supposedly managed this situation.
Listen, guys, as much as I watch videos about politics and war, the more I understand that politics is very dirty, and politicians, they are not afraid to go trade their morals, for money, power, and greed. And basically, the ones who are paying for their greed and morals are we, just like normal guys that are just want to live normal life. Unfortunately, this is how the system works. There's no way around it.
The genocide itself didn't stop until India conducted a military intervention against the Pakistani army, something that Kissinger condemned. As much as you may wish to oppose a war or war in general, opposition to war or opposition to intervening in a war more often than not means siding with the winning side, or at least some very less than savory figures. This is not to say that domestic opposition to conflict is in itself always an intentional statement of taking a side, but in many instances it is. The build-up to the Iraq War in 2003 was marked and marred by misinformation spread by senior figures and the leaders of the US government intent on garnering public support for a false cause for war.
Yes, I remember this famous what was the guy from Bush administration? He said we have a proof that they are using chemical weapons. What proofs you have? We have aluminum tubes. They're using aluminum tubes. Dave Chappelle had a great bit about that. I recommend to watch it also.
Were reasonable reasons to protest military intervention, chief amongst them how the public had been misled by their president and his cabinet. But that protest came also with embarrassing measures, such as the Vatican inviting Saddam Hussein's only Christian minister, the Catholic Tariq Aziz, to the Vatican for prayers for peace. Tariq Aziz is the man who, under Saddam's orders, instructed the Iraqi army to murder 200,000 Kurds from 1986 to 1989. He was also instrumental in the violent suppression of Shia uprisings in 1991 and 1999, during which hundreds of thousands were killed. He is also known as the Children Thief for instituting a security program kidnapping children from Shia and Kurdish families as hostages to ensure these populations would not rebel. So not exactly a figure for peace. Which leads to a few questions in retrospect, which are barely asked about the Iraq War, but which are important. If the Bush-Cheney administration had not conjured up a threat of mass destruction that didn't exist, would the war have been justified with the brutality of the Saddam regime? Would instigating a war with the stated intention of removing a genocidal dictator rather than made-up chemical weapons made that war more acceptable? Or was the disastrous planning of the war and occupation by people like Paul Brenner and its consequences the reason the war was so unacceptable? Would there have been just as many protests if the reasons for the war had remained the same, but the occupation had been less of a disaster? These are an uncomfortable set of questions, especially since the Iraq War is still fresh in our memories and we live with the consequences of its failures. Something we might discuss in a future video on why the Iraq War was such a disaster. One thing that should be addressed for this video is that the United States did not go to war in Iraq for oil. That's a populist myth. Governments can't simply, through military force, take other countries' resources, at least in our day and age.
That's what I thought, you know. I thought that big companies that are like responsible, like not responsible, that are like doing like all the oil operations all around the world, right? They like, for them that was very good thing, because then they could seize the power, right, by the local CEOs of the companies, or somehow bribe people, you know, to get more influence, and in the end seize the oil fields of Iraq. That's what I thought, but you know, you never know.
Decide themselves what they do with them, and the Iraqi government sold its oil themselves, and they sold it to the Chinese. Although wars for natural resources have been fought throughout most of human history, they are far less common now in our day and age than ever before. And the war in Iraq was not a war fought for resources. The war in Iraq was fought because the Bush administration believed it could build an allied democracy in the Middle East. But instead it created a theocracy allied to Iran. Ergo, the goal was not resources, but the widening of American geopolitical influence. And this raises another important question. Why does the United States design its foreign policy to widen its global influence? Conflicts have, to our day and age, declined greatly. Nations seldom openly engage in conflicts with each other, known as interstate wars. Civil wars and militarized interstate disputes are now more common than open international national conflicts, as is the instigation of such to destabilize geopolitical opponents, or
Yes, this is what's happening in Israel right now, between Israel and Gaza, and like other like countries that are around there. This is what's happening in Ukraine right now. I'm not saying even what's happening in Africa. Like in Africa, like wars never stop, I guess. Like one dictator comes to power, then another dictator comes to power. They fight for the resources all the time.
undercut their ambitions. Outright invading another country to subsume it within your sphere of influence is rarer now than in previous centuries. The subverting of countries into your sphere of influence by other means is more common, not because it is easier, but because open violent aggression invites harsh retaliation.
Exactly.
Consequently, the past 80 years have been dominated by either proxy wars, militarized border disputes, militant insurrections, the support of terror organizations, and attempts at subversions or starting insurrections.
Take a look what happened in Ukraine, right? Russia attacked Ukraine, like straight war conflict, and basically now USA, Europe, all the major powers are backing Ukraine, so it makes for Russia very, very difficult, to win this one.
Nonetheless, leaves us within a world of conflicts. And in this world of conflicts, the United States is not the only actor with ambitions. In public conversations in Western democracies about international politics and interventions, the activities of outside actors with their own interests and ambitions are often ignored. One should never forget that in a debate about how one wants to engage on the international stage, that others also engage on the international stage, and that naively hoping that those others may have your own best interests at heart will most likely not work. How can nations engage in a world of conflicts? Neutrality is of course an option to take in the world of conflict, but many people confuse neutrality with pacifism. Switzerland is the most neutral there is, and it is not some sort of pacifist mountain paradise, but practically a fortress. Up until the 2000s, all border crossing bridges into the country were laced with explosives, so the army could at any moment destroy all entry points into the country.
Wow.
Mountains are littered with bunkers and artillery positions. Every man must serve a year in the army, and the country has one of the best equipped and expensive militaries in Europe. Staying neutral in conflict means above all standing alone. Having no enemies also means having no friends, which means having lots of potential enemies, for which you have to prepare. Countries that maintain neutrality more often than not have some of the most well-trained and expansive militaries in their neighborhood, allowing them to feel safe in that neighborhood. Neutrality is also not a lack of aggression. During World War II, the Swiss shot down both German and American planes that violated their airspace.
Wow,
neutrality doesn't just mean remaining out of conflict, it means seeing everyone as a potential threat to yourself and preparing for such. Because neutral countries that don't get Belgiumed.
Yeah.
What might seem the most pacifist position at first is to not have an army at all, and 22 countries go that way, not having any army whatsoever. However, this comes with considerable sacrifice and might not seem as great as it may seem at first. Many of these countries are micronations with no strategic value. If nobody watches or cares about you, that means nobody will care if you don't have an army. And if someone does take an interest in you, the maximum costs you can inflict on an outsider are too small to deter action. Monaco annoyed France with being a tax haven for the wealthy French for a very long time. When Monaco refused to open its banking secrets of French citizens to French authorities, the French just blockaded the armyless micronation until it did. All the Caribbean and Central American nations without militaries are without army, as they are in the American sphere of influence, the most important of which is Panama, with its canal. If anyone were to ever mess with that canal, even if it's the Panamanians themselves, that strategic interest will draw the big guy into conflict.
Listen, this guy, the guy on the right, his name is Noriega. Basically, he was a general during the Cold War, and he was first of all, he was supporting USA, and fighting against communism, and by that he was smuggling cocaine through I think I'm not sure. Is he from Panama? Okay, probably he's Panama. I thought he's from another South American country, but anyways, he smuggled cocaine through Panama right into USA, because USA was backing him. And then in one moment, USA said, okay, we are starting war on drugs. and unfortunately he got like ties together with the notorious Pablo Escobar, and USA smoked him, right? So, well, that was interesting.
Themselves, that strategic interest will draw the big guy into conflict. The other Caribbeans without army also have the inconvenience of security dependency. In its history, the United States engaged in both foreign policy approaches for its first 200 years, neutrality and limitations of force. It remained in a Jeffersonian policy of not engaging in foreign conflicts and alliances, remaining out of foreign wars, but also established a navy to protect its own shores. Ground forces were for most used in internal conflicts and expansions. US foreign involvement increased in the late 1800s, not intent to create an empire or to spread its way of life, but to open new markets for its products, a central drive for American foreign policy. Then World War I. When the US for the first time engaged in a foreign conflict with the expressed interest of spreading its way of life, demanding decolonization and democracy from both allies and defeated, the efforts by its president were shut down, not from abroad, but internally through opposition to such a policy. The United States shut itself out again and re-engaged in a policy of neutrality, with a large navy to defend what was only hers, and then World War II. It was at this time that a series of events that pushed the United States into a more aggressive foreign policy occurred. Because as the US was absent as a backer of democracy in the world collapsed into tyranny, and that tyranny eventually came knocking down its door. In the post-war 1950s, the Americans positioned themselves as the arsenal of democracy to stem the spread of totalitarianism. Post-war politicians in the United States saw the biggest lesson to be learned out of the Second World War, that foreign dictators had to be crushed before they could gain enough power to threaten the United States. However, that post-war foreign policy came with a heavy emphasis on defeating one specific ideology rather than spreading its own way of life. You can also, if you're lucky, be Iceland. Geopolitically so insignificant that nobody will ever care for you. This means you don't need an army and you don't have to worry about anyone trying to take over from abroad. At least until climate change makes you important enough to care about. There are several countries that are geographically shaped in a way that makes it close to impossible to conquer them without chewing your teeth out in the process. Two countries that have that benefit happen to have once been at war with each other, Vietnam and the United States. Both are undesirable enemies in conflict. Both share geographical features, making them both hard to conquer. But only one has a global reach. It was during and after that war that both these countries learned that the best guarantor for stability are friendships or alliances. Barely any American allies would join them in their Southeast Asian adventure, leaving them stranded with a close to impossible task, which taught the Americans the value of allies and the disadvantages of unilateral action. The Vietnamese had many allies supporting them in ending that American adventure. But once the Americans were gone, those allies sought out influence over Vietnam through force themselves. With Vietnam having that big bully neighbor, it also learned the value of friendship, which curiously led to those two countries who fought one of the bloodiest and most vicious conflicts of history becoming friends. In a world of conflicts, the best way of surviving and ensuring your ability to stay independent is by allying yourself against common foes. Or if you wish to grow your influence, ally yourself to spread your influence. Alliances can be formed based on common ideology. However, if anyone ever steps out of line, that results in eternal conflicts. The world's largest military alliance in human history was not based on common ideology, but unified against a common enemy. The Western Alliance, with its American leadership, wasn't really all that Western. It contained defensive pacts with more than 60 countries, contained 25% of the world's population and 75% of the global economy, from South Korea to Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, Israel and Argentina, with NATO at its core.
Listen, this video is dropping some knowledge bombs over here. I didn't know that so many countries were involved in this. Like, of course it makes perfect sense, right? Because like some countries were like part of empires, or they were like, let's say Australia, they were part of United Kingdom back in the day, the Great Britain, I mean, and this makes perfect sense if you think about it so deeply. This guy makes me think a lot.
was a bundle of nations that weren't ideologically aligned in anything. Some of them even hated or went to war with each other despite being supposedly on the same side. But they all were united in one commonality. They were all opposed to Soviet communism, which resulted in weird, entangled networks of military assistance, such as the United States sending Israeli weapons to the Pakistani government to arm Saudi fanatics in a war against the Soviet Union. However, when Soviet communism came to its end, the alliance lost the one thing that kept it glued together: the enemy. This produced an American sphere of influence with no unified purpose. The American presence, once seen as a protector, increasingly started to be seen as an American occupation abroad and as entanglement in foreign conflicts at home.
Yeah, exactly. And America cannot already withdraw their influence, right? Who is withdrawing their influence when they have such influence? Nobody. Nobody will do it, right? So, it's probably, like the thing as it had to happen, like when the enemies go away, the allies start thinking why we are under USA. We want to be free, but you won't never be free. If you won't be under USA, you're gonna be under somebody else big, some another alliance who's gonna be created, and it might be much worse than USA.
Entanglements compounded by conflicts within that sphere of influence, the lack of commonality in ideology and purpose, and the eventual attack against the main guarantor of the alliance from within supposed allies became increasingly unpopular. The United States has had close military ties with Pakistan since the 1950s, as Pakistan's rival India was closely tied to the Soviet Union. But as the Cold War ground itself to an end, that relationship became somewhat strenuous. Pakistan aided terrorist groups such as the Taliban even as they were fighting the Americans, secretly built a nuclear weapons program with the help of one of America's biggest rivals, harbored and provided safety to the enemies of the United States, and used military aid given to them to train terror groups that were sent to undermine a neighboring democratic society. All of it while it remained a dictatorial Islamist theocracy. The network of allied nations built to coordinate a common effort against a common enemy turned into an entanglement of conflicting interests, ideologies, and ambitions. Britain was the predominant global superpower for 2 centuries, and that power was built on the reach of its global navy. To secure that position, Britain had to ensure that nobody else would ever build a navy that could rival its own. Britain did so by shaping alliances of common interest, chief among them with its once adversary France. France had different reasons for its conflicts with Russia, Japan, and Germany, but its interests aligned itself with the interests of Britain, consequently creating an alliance that would shape the coming centuries. And by the dawn of the 20th century, that alliance had evolved from being held together by common interest to being held together by a common commitment and agreement to protect democracy in Europe. Finding common interests and aligning geopolitical ambitions are the main reason many nations remain in a military alliance to the United States. As long as the United States needs Saudi oil, it will ally itself with the Saudis against its adversaries. The Saudis, for their part, will not pacify the situation themselves, because with the backing of the United States military, they have no incentive to find a peace that also appeases the Iranians. And consequently, that conflict the Americans find themselves currently hoisted into is a conflict solely driven by geopolitical interests, instead of a commonality in values, which are non-existent.
Listen, for normal people, like for us, it's like we're thinking that a relationship between countries is like love and hate relationship or something like that. No, it's never emotional. It's always geopolitical, man. It's always about the interests. It's about the common interests, right? It's about getting value from this alliance, right? And there's no way around it.
This process by which nations are roped into each other's conflicts through systems of geopolitical alliances that result in provocations and conflicts that draw a wider set of nations into conflict by making foreign conflicts their conflicts and thereby escalating conflicts is known as entanglement theory. There is, however, another way. The most successful alliances are those that transcend mere geopolitical ambition. Turkey may have recently formed a military pact with Russia, but everyone knows they both intend to backstab each other at some point. The question merely is who will stab first. At the core of the Western Alliance sat NATO, and its agreement was simple. An attack against one is an attack against all. Members must be democratic, and members must be willing to contribute to the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. The last part means that all NATO members are required to spend a minimum of 2% of their annual budget on military spending for armed forces to protect the wider geopolitical interests of the alliance. Far from being a constraint, this acts as a loophole, breaking entanglement in what is called freedom of action theory. Within an alliance, putting terms and conditions on how much, on what conditions, and to what extent military assistance is lent detangles global powers from an overstretched geopolitical web while maintaining a wide deterrence network. For effective alliances, one requires effective allies. Alliances that rely on ineffective partners, thereby putting more strain on the main power of such, are more likely to fail.
Yeah, example is the Second World War, Germany and Italy, man. Italy was so pointless. I mean, their army was so weak, and most of the fights that they were participating, they were more a burden than like a helper, man.
However, NATO is everything but a detangled alliance. Only 11 countries meet the 2% NATO spending limit. Many have armed forces that are ineffective or in poor state, and some NATO members don't even have any armed forces.
Well, now it's changed. After the war in Ukraine, all the NATO members in Europe started to put more money into defense. And Latvia also, now we have like from 18 years of age, you have to go to army, right? Before that, we didn't have it, right? And yeah, they're building at the border, they're building the anti-tank like walls and etc. So basically, they are getting ready for a fight.
In the wake of the end of the Cold War, many NATO members slacked behind in their commitment, thereby furthering the entanglement of the United States by forcing it into having to come up at its own cost for the military deficiencies of others. If you ever wondered why US military spending is so high, it has a lot to do with the fact that it has to jump in for allies who themselves do not stick to their commitments. An international military presence that should be partially staffed by others is consequently staffed by Americans at their own cost.
Yes, but in the same time, America is not only doing that because like the allies are not fulfilling their things that they have to do, yeah, because it's still American domination, right? American sphere of influence. And basically, America is the big brother, and we are the small brothers over here. And when the small brothers are not able to like do what they have to do, the big brother comes in and sorts the things out. Because either if he doesn't do that, he's gonna lose his small brothers. You know, he won't have anything to influence. So.
In a political environment dominated by cheap slogans and buzzwords, what is overlooked is that this time of ours is a period of post-Cold War entanglement, de-entanglement, possible new entanglement, old entanglements, revitalized geopolitical ambitions, new geopolitical ambitions, and attempts at revitalizing common interests. The flexing of international muscle by various actors has not simply gone away. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many ways, Russia inherited the geopolitical ambitions of the Soviet Union. Neither has the fact disappeared that these interests conflict with not merely the economic but also the security interests of others, and even spread ideological systems in conflict with others. The questions that Americans but also Europeans and increasingly Australians, Japanese and Koreans will face is over how they come to common interests in that environment. As much as retreat, neutrality and isolationism may seem to be an option, it might actually be the tougher and more dangerous one. If there is to be a total disentanglement, rivals might take advantage of such. Increased entanglement to keep rivals at bay at the cost of the major powers. One can reshape into an alliance transcending geopolitical interests, united in common ground and freedom of action, which however might sway prior allies to leave and seek closer ties with rivals with whom they have a more common commitment. In sum total, in our modern-day world of conflicts, an observation to be made is that other powers have overcome the post-Cold War era to establish themselves and re-establish themselves in pursuit of clear goals, while the winners of the Cold War spent too much time in a self-congratulatory post-Cold War comfort zone. When they were violently turned out of it, they found themselves trapped in an international entanglement of contradictions from which they have yet to find the path to take in the future. Which path they will take is yet to be formulated, and something that some within this audience will possibly even vote on in the future.